What's good, YouTube? It's Boy Squid back in another video. Let's do a quick little tier list review for post-Phantom Nightmare because we have a lot of changes with the meta game. This is a very influential booster pack that has a lot of new toys that basically reshape the entire meta. We have, the Snake Eyes stuff coming out. There are a couple of new decks coming out as well. We have the Ritual deck on the horizon, the Voiceless. So yeah, there's a lot of new changes. So without further ado, I think let's dive in. This is going to be the metagame for the upcoming 3v3 YCS Costa Rica as well as 3v3 YCS Vegas. We're not going to get any events until at least about a month later, which leaves some downtime for you guys to test out. So without further ado, we have a couple of tiers here. Tier 0.5 is actually like the best solid decks that I feel like are a step up behind the actual tier 1 decks. So the decks that are actually like decently good, these decks are like very good, that there's kind of a gap between these decks and then the next decks that are somewhat playable. Tier 2 is just like, decks that can still compete and do well at regionals, but I don't know if they're like insanely good. And then not relevant is just decks that I don't think are that relevant. They can obviously do well on a local level, maybe at a regional, but they're just not great. And they get kind of caught in the crossfire with a lot of things happening with the meta developing. So yeah, tier 0.5, I mean, Snake Eye Fire King, there's no argument there that this is one of the most hype decks right now. It's the best deck in the OCG as well after they nerfed a lot of things. And yeah, I mean, the deck is just insane with the Snake Eye stuff. You can bridge really easily into the Fire King Ponix and then go full combo. Your interrupts are always diversified. You have stuff in the graveyard, stuff in the hand, and then stuff on the field. And it has very good follow-up as well. It has very good recursion. It reminds me a lot about Unchained. And the Snake Eye Populace that's coming out just pushes this deck over the edge. So yeah, there's no real argument. I think this is probably the best deck. Now, the other deck that's somewhat on the similar level, but I would say is worse slightly than the Fire King deck, is the Snake Eyes deck. Yeah, the pure Snake Eyes deck, if you're playing things like Jet Synchron in this deck, you can actually do a lot of cool things. And you can make your board something like a Borreload Savage Dragon, a Baron de Fleur, and then have a Formula Synchron. So the Formula Synchron actually goes well with the Flamberg Dragon during your opponent's turn to go into the Baron de Fleur, and then Flamberg will trigger, allowing you to summon back 2 level 1s, and then get the effects to search. So if you get Snake Eyes Ash, Snake Eyes Populace, searching follow-up. So the deck is very resilient, and part of the reason why you might want to play this over Fire King is the fact that you don't have to play a lot of Fire King fluff. Now, the Fire King deck, it's ironic. The worst cards in that deck are just the Fire King cards themselves because you don't really want to draw them. You'd rather just branch off of them through the simple spoil stuff by playing Original, going into Ponix, and then searching everything. Otherwise, drawing anything short of Kieran's decent because you can dodge targeting removal, but the rest of the cards are just not that great. Whereas Pure Snake Eye, you're very laser focused on making the Pure Snake Eye plays. You don't have as many bricks. But the issue with this deck is it's also more susceptible to certain hand traps like Nibiru, also more susceptible to a multitude of hand traps because the Fire King stuff is a whole nother level of extension. It's a whole nother ceiling, right? Whereas Snake Eye, you're really bound by the Snake Eye stuff. But Fire Kings, they can do both. They can do the Snake Eye stuff and they can also do the Fire King stuff. So there's a lot of kind of room for you to extend. Next, let's talk about, well, I guess PURRELYs. I actually think they're probably close to tier 1. I mean, you could make an argument to say that they're probably between tier 1 and tier 2, but I think they are the type of deck that if people are not prepared, it can be really devastating. Like, imagine going up against an Purrely Noir with like 7+ materials and you have absolutely no answer in your deck. Then it makes it really hard. A lot of people are not playing Underworld Goddess because there's just not a lot of space in the actual Snake Eyes toolbox to fit her in. So it just makes it really hard to get rid of the Purrely Noir. Now, bear in mind that there is one card called Kurikara Div Incarnate, which can actually be searched off of Snake Eyes Ash because it's a level 1 fire monster, level 1. So that means that if people are actually respecting Purrely and they side it, it might make Purrely a little worse. But personally, I still think it's between tier 1 and tier 2, depending on how prepared people are for the deck. Now, people are playing a lot of hand traps in this upcoming format, so that kind of gets caught in the crossfire for Purrely, because if you're taking Bailers or an Imperms to your Purrely monsters, that just makes it a lot harder to actually end on a good board, because you're investing resources to send out of your hand each time you activate a quick play spell. So those are my thoughts on Purrely. FLOOWANDEREEZE, I think probably tier 2 for the sheer fact that they can play Shifter. You guys don't know how powerful and high impact of a card Shifter is for the upcoming format just because of the Snake Eyes stuff and the Fire King. They're so so graveyard dependent. Everything triggers in the graveyard. All the Fire King stuff when they're destroyed and sent to the graveyard. The Snake Eye stuff, sending Flamberg to the graveyard. Populous to the graveyard to scale itself back. There's so many things that basically revolve around the graveyard. And even the Voiceless deck also requires the graveyard as well. So a lot of new powerful decks are making use of the graveyard. So if you're playing Shifter in a deck like Flu, then you're probably very favored to win if you do open it. Branded, I would say probably tier 2. The deck actually has some legs because activating Branded Fusion against a deck like Fire King and Snake Eyes is actually probably one of the only cards that can possibly have a good chance of pushing through everything that they have, because you don't really care about your monsters getting popped, right? Because everything kind of triggers in the graveyard. You know, you have like Lubellion, Albion, and Mirror Jade can start banishing things, so it's very, very nice that it doesn't target either. But the problem is consistency. Like, you will be facing off into Ashes all day, especially against fire decks. They're really easy for them to add the Ash back using something like a Salamangreat Sunlight Wolf. So if you make it to the grind game and your opponent is able to recycle their Ash over and over, you're just not going to win, right? Your Branded Fusion is never resolving. If Branded Fusion was guaranteed to resolve all of the time, then I would say this deck is very, very high tier 1, but unfortunately it's just not the case, especially when you have to deal with Ash plus like any semblance of a board. It just makes it really hard for the deck to play. So in my opinion, it's just tier 2. Sprites, I would say probably tier 2 as well. The deck's just not great. It does play somewhat well into hand traps, but it's just like without Sprite Elf, it's just, the deck's power crept now so hard that sprites are just not very, very powerful. I'd love to be proven wrong, but I feel like this deck has just kind of been power crept by what we have right now in the fire stuff, and there's no level 2 support at the moment. Vanquish, so I could see as a low tier 1 to a high tier 2 deck. The deck still does a lot of what it previously did, you know, just summoning Raisin and just looping a bunch of cards and playing a bunch of hand traps. The nice thing about decks like Vanquish, though, is you can actually side Shifter because it doesn't really hurt you as much as it does for the Sinful Spoil. Same with Purely. I've seen some players siding Shifter as well. That's probably an option. So the decks that can play Shifter, I always like tend to favor because that just, it's like an auto win button. But in Vanquish, so specifically, it's kind of hard for you to mount like a board after you Shifter, so that can be kind of detrimental. If a deck is getting Shifter, they pass and they survive, they can just try to play again on their turn. So sometimes that one turn buyout is just not good enough. But I still think the deck is decent, that it's probably like a low tier 1. So Voiceless is a new deck that's, I want to say, like the modern ritual deck of 2024. Effectively, you take advantage of cards like Skull Guardian that is an Omni Negate, and a lot of one-card combos. You can make use of Diviner the Herald as well to send the Trias and then tribute it and summon out the new Novox. So I think the deck is definitely tier 1 from what I've seen. It does suffer a little bit from consistency issues. Sometimes you do kind of brick, or sometimes you have certain hands where it plays heavily into hand traps like Drone Lockbird or like an Effect Veiler Imperm on your normal summon. And that's not all the time. A lot of times you can play around it, which is why I think the deck is so good. Like, the board that they put up is really hard for you to break because it prevents you from targeting things. Basically prevents your monster from being destroyed by battle because they have a 4K beater on the field. And then they have the Omni Negate. They can also side hand traps. They can side floodgates like Summon Limit. I think the deck is actually really, really scary. And I want to say it's probably a really high tier 1. Rescue Ace is another deck that I think is a high tier 1. I think it's a little bit worse than the Snake Eyes and the Fire King stuff just because they do only have one Airlifter, so the consistency hurts a lot. Now, bear in mind, you can actually play Promethean Princess as well as the Populace in this deck as one copy as well. So it still kind of receives a boost from all the stuff that's coming out in Phantom Nightmare. So I still think it's between tier 0.5 and tier 1. It's actually a really, really good deck. And then KASHTIRA, I would say high tier 2 to low tier 1 because this deck is actually somewhat viable because it's a Shifter deck and you have a lot of different ways to play with the engine. Like, you can obviously play pure KASHTIRA, but you can also play things like the Earthbound engine. You can play potentially the Shark engine. There are a lot of cool things that you can do because the deck doesn't really rely on the normal summon. And the best part about all of this is obviously D-Shifter and the fact that when you go first now, you can do like odd plays like go into the Heat Soul off of the Draco Sack, making 2 Link Spiders into the G-Golem Crystal Heart. And there are a lot of cool ways that this deck can kind of act as a control deck that also plays Shifter, which has the potential to OTK, obviously, through Shifter, because a standard line with the Unicorn into Theosis, into Fenrir, like a Scareclaw, like a lot of times you can just do 8100 damage plus, so I think it's quite good, quite possibly the best Shifter deck, honestly, if I'm being honest. Mannadium, I want to say, is very low tier 1 right now. The issue with this deck is everyone's playing hand traps, multiple hand traps. We're talking like 9 to 12 to 15 hand traps, especially Drone Lockbird is being mained. And this deck gets hurt by basically every hand trap, like Veiler, Imperm, Phantasme, Nibiru, Shifter, Drone Lockbird. Like nothing really locks them out completely besides something like a Droll, which is well timed. But multitudes of hand traps being slung around across 12 rounds will actually hurt your consistency playing this deck. So I just don't think it's good enough. Tearlaments, I want to say, is also low tier 1 / high tier 2. The issue with this deck is that obviously they lost the main power cards, Yugioh and Kelbeck, milling 5, and that variance of that aspect of randomness that allows them to actually just win based on variance is kind of gone now. You can still mill godlike, but it's not nearly as godlike. The nice thing though is you can play the shufflers, Medora and Keldo, and those cards are actually very, very powerful against graveyard based decks like Fire King or Sinful Spoils. So I would say probably low tier 1-ish. Labyrinth, I will say, is probably between tier 0.5 and high tier 1. I'm going to put it to high tier 1 because I don't actually think it has a good matchup against the fire decks, especially going second. This deck can't really afford to play, obviously, 12 hand traps. You would have to... A lot of the interrupts I find are multiple cards. So if you have something like the Butler plus like a DD Ground or a trap you can set and then have immediate high impact, it sort of serves as a hand trap interruption. You could potentially have a furniture card and Keldo or Medora, and that's another interruption. But a lot of things are 2 cards. Like they can play Nibiru as well, but it's sometimes not enough just with 1 hand trap. But that being said, they are getting transaction rollback this week, and that card is very, very degenerate. So I still think against other decks, Labyrinth just is so favored. Like transaction rollback and like infinite resources, the deck is just very, very powerful. But then when it plays against the fire decks, it's just very, very volatile. So it kind of has that struggle factor going second into a board that has like a RUNICK, Princess, a bunch of pops. If people are playing Fire King, Skyfire, or Skyburn, it just makes it even worse. So that's why I think it's beneath the top 2 decks, but it's still probably one of the top 3 decks, if that makes sense. Salamangreat, I think, is probably like a high... Honestly, like a low tier 1, I guess. It's probably better than these tier 2 decks, but the thing is, we are getting Promethean Princess, which is actually decently good in the Salad deck as well. Now you can just link climb so easily and effectively, and the fire support, it definitely helps, but you can't really play simple slow stuff because you do rely on your normal summon to summon like the Salamangreat monsters. So I think it's the worst fire deck of them all, but it's probably somewhere in the tier 1 region where it's still decently good enough because you do get to play a plethora of hand traps as well. The branded, Chimera / branded Chimera, I want to say like very low tier 2 or not relevant. The issue with this deck is everyone's playing hand traps, and this deck gets very, very hurt by a lot of hand traps. Veiler on like your Berfomet or Imperm. Sometimes people are playing Drone Lockbird, that can hurt as well. Even Nibiru sometimes catches them off guard a little bit, and everyone's playing Ash, and it's just like hand traps being slung around makes it really feel bad for a deck like this, so I don't think it's that high up in the tier list. Same thing with SWORDSOUL, too many hand traps. You're getting Nib basically every time now, or Nib plus Veiler / Imperm when you have Baron on board. So it's just not great. And then going second, you can't really break boards either with neither of these 2 decks. Centurion, I would say, is also tier 2. It's obviously nice when you go first, you don't get impeded and you just put on like the full board, and then you have Crimson Dragon to go into the Calamity. But again, everyone's playing hand traps, so it's very, very hard to do that. And going second, you obviously have to play a lot of hand traps with Centurion. It's not really great at breaking boards. And the issue is a lot of decks like Fire King and Snake Eye can play through multiple hand traps and put up some semblance of interruption. And even like 1 or 2 interruptions sometimes really hurts the Centurion deck, because if you're not putting through your Horus Engine or like your normal summon, then it's very, very hard for you to do anything, right? So that's why I don't think it's that great. Sky Striker is probably not relevant either. Obviously, the spell cards. A lot of people are citing anti-spell now as well, so that just hurts the deck. Magic Deflector, and the deck just like relies on hand traps. Again, it's not good enough at breaking boards right now because everything they have is targeting. Like the Widow Anchor is targeting, the opponent could just chain Kirin. Same with like the Afterburners, and like destroying stuff is just no good at all because they get all their triggering effects in the graveyard. Dragon Link, I think is like probably tier 2. It's just not great enough for it to be viable. It's an okay deck, but again, like the consistency hits, like Chaos Space to 1 just doesn't do it any favors. Now that everyone's playing a lot of hand traps, it probably doesn't help either. Like this deck also gets a little bit cut off by like multiple hand traps being slung to its face, like Nibiru, Effect Veiler, everything. Unchained, I think, is pretty non-relevant. Unfortunately, the hit on the ban list, putting our red dog to 1, just hurts so bad. And now we have a better deck that does basically the same thing, but like 10 times better in the form of Sinful Swell / Fire King, and also 10 times more resilient, especially with that hit in mind. So that's why I think it's not relevant. EXOSISTER also not very relevant. Obviously, you can play D-Shifter, so that helps, but it's very, very hard for that deck to break boards, and you play traps in the deck, which is no good when you have the level of speed that these two decks up here can provide in a metagame. You just can't keep up. I don't think ORCUST is relevant. Honestly, like, pre-Phantom Nightmare, it might have been, like, tier 2-ish. I never thought the deck was good. One Heart Pour doesn't do it really any favors at all, and it's definitely way too outdated to compete with the Sinful Spoils and the modernized stuff. RIKKA, I think, is also not very relevant because of the hits. Now, I know we are getting some new support. I'm not exactly sure what the new plant stuff does, but if you guys know if the Aerocephamy or the Aeromage stuff is any good, then maybe this could be boosted up, but I haven't had a chance to see them do anything in the OCG, nor have I really taken time to explore the cards, so I'm not sure. INFERNOBLEs, I would say, probably along the lines of not relevant either. Unfortunately, losing a soul just hurts too much, and when you have multiple hand traps that kind of just like really hurt this deck, I think it's very, very hard for a deck like this to thrive. You know, you're getting hit by hand traps left and right. Doesn't matter how many extenders you have. None of the extenders are actually as powerful as the Sinful Spoils and the Flamberg stuff that the Fire King and the Snake Eyes stuff has, so it's a little unfortunate in that aspect. And then last but not least, I totally forgot about this, but the Runick variants, obviously the BYSTIAL Runick deck, I think is probably along the lines of tier 2 as well. Unfortunately, it does get hit by a lot of things that are in the metagame, like Cosmic Cyclone. Everyone's siding that card now because it's so good against like the Fire King as well as the Snake Eyes stuff, because they're scaling a bunch of stuff as spell and traps, and also they're playing field spells. And the Runick decks, I just don't think can keep up. People are siding at playing Drolls as well in the main deck. It just shuts off a lot of what the deck previously could do. Now the deck has just been power crept in my opinion, so I just don't think it's great. Guys, what are your thoughts on this tier list? Are there any decks that we missed? And are there any things that you disagree with? These are usually like the most debatable type of videos out there because people have their own opinions about how the metagame is going to shape up. Let us know in the comments below. And yeah, thanks a lot for tuning in. We'll see y'all in the next video.